I'm John McQuay with 8541 Tactical, and we are here today to talk about the Vogel competition trigger system for Glock pistols. This is a trigger that's endorsed by Bob Vogel, who's a world-renowned shooter in IDPA, USPSA, and a couple of other disciplines. But he is a Glock shooter, and this is a trigger that he uses in his guns. It was provided to us by GlockTriggers.com. Jeff over at Glock Triggers was nice enough to answer our email rather quickly and send this trigger out to us. And normally, like for instance in my work gun, my Glock 21 that I carry on the street, actually has a factory Glock trigger in it. It has a factory minus connector because in the 21 SF guns, the trigger pull ended up being about a pound heavier than it was in the original 21s. The original Glock 21 had a little bit lighter trigger. So our agency put minus connectors in all the guns, so they're all factory Glock parts. Well, this here is a Glock 17 Gen 4, and this is a gun that I'm shooting in IDPA competition and also various different range stuff. So it's not a primarily defensive handgun, although after we install the trigger, if it's still within what I would deem the appropriate reliability and trigger pull weight for a carry gun, then I may continue to carry it with this trigger system. On the Gen 4s, because of some of the redesigns that Glock did, just replacing the connector with a lower weight connector will not drop your trigger pull appreciably. The Gen 4s come with a dot connector, which is a slightly different geometry than the original connectors and the minus connector. It's closer to a minus connector than it is the original one. I've actually dropped a Lone Wolf 3.5 pound connector into this thing, and it really didn't seem to affect the trigger pull at all. Now I've got my trusty trigger pull gauge here, and we're going to go ahead and see what the trigger pull is on the handgun right now. And as you can see, there is no magazine in the magazine well. There is no cartridge in the chamber. Fired it in safe direction. Striker fell, so we know it's clear. Gonna go ahead and fire up our Lyman trigger pull gauge here, and it's reading 0. And the trick about Glock triggers when you're using a trigger pull gauge is making sure you get that safety depressed and then trying to get a straight pull on them. 6 pounds, 1.5 ounces. 6 pounds, 5 ounces. 6 pounds, 1.5 ounces. We'll do it one more time. And 6 pounds, 9 ounces. Now you're probably getting a little bit of variance there on the ounces based upon where the actual hook there hits on the trigger. Since we've got a curved trigger and it's pivoting back, then there can be some variation depending on that. But we have a 6+ pound trigger, which as a precision rifle shooter, although I can shoot this gun just fine, as you've seen some of our other videos with a 6 pound trigger on it, I'm quite sure I will be able to shoot it faster with a lighter trigger, and it will allow me to get longer range, more accurate shots quicker than with the heavier trigger. So we're going to go ahead and install the Vogel competition trigger system on it today and show you how easy it is to install. Now the main difference on the Vogel trigger system than some of the other ones out there is it uses all Glock parts. All the parts on this system are factory parts, so you got factory trigger bar, trigger housing. I don't know if the connector is a factory piece or if it's an aftermarket connector that they have done something to. And the springs are, of course, proprietary spring weights for this trigger system. Now, The first thing you'll notice about the Vogel competition trigger from Glock Triggers here is this incredibly shiny finish. It is either a high polish or a chrome finish. When we do the full review, I'll let you know if it is or if it's not, if they've done something more than the regular factory finish. I believe the factory Glock parts have a hard chrome on them, because I've actually had a cruciform sear on the trigger bar in a Glock 21. I've had the chrome finish flake off of it before because of the high round count, and I guess there's probably a little bit of an issue on that chrome finishing. Pistol still worked fine, but it bothered me since it was a work gun, so I swapped the cruciform sear out on that. But this is a much higher polish than I've seen on any factory Glock parts, so it's definitely attractive. It'll be the last time you ever see it this clean when it goes into this handgun, because I really shoot Glocks dirty. Now this is exactly the way it comes when you take it out of the tube. It's banded together like this, and they put a nice zip tie on here. We're going to set that aside for right now. You also get 3 different striker springs, 4.5 pound, a 4 pound, and a 5 pound. I believe the factory striker spring is about a 5.5 pound. You get a firing pin block and firing pin block spring that we're going to replace, and again, it's a high polish finish. And then you get 2 replacement firing pin spring cups, or striker spring cups. These are great because when you go to replace that spring, sometimes they can go flying, and it's just nice that they included them so you don't have to worry about replacing them, or if your factory spring cups are torn up. And finally, you get an Allen key to adjust this little screw right here on the back of the trigger housing, and that is going to adjust our over travel. And that's one of the big things about this trigger system, is it has reduced over travel, so that's going to allow you to hopefully decrease your split times a little bit. But it just takes up a little bit of that, so you can get that trigger reset a little bit quicker. So we're going to set this aside, and we're going to go ahead and show you how to break down the Glock. It's a very simple process. Again, magazine well is clear and the chamber is clear. We're going to drop the slide. This is very key. Make sure you pointed it in a safe direction. There's nothing in front of me here. Sometimes guys get really complacent about this because you have to press the trigger every time you disassemble a Glock. Make sure it's pointed in a safe direction. Don't just honk on that trigger. Safe direction, trigger press. Now we're going to go ahead and disassemble. All you need to do, and the way I like to do it, is reach up over the back of the pistol here and just pull slightly back to take some pressure off of that slide lock, and then slide it forward off the frame. And we're going to set the slide and barrel assembly aside for right now. Now you're going to need a Glock Armor's tool or an appropriate size punch for this. And the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and punch out our first pin. Just punch it out of the frame, set that aside. Now we're going to punch out our second pin, and there's a little bit of a trick on punching out the second pin. You're going to need to push down on it, and you may need to wiggle the slide stop just a little bit. And it should push right back out. You don't need to take a hammer or anything and pound on that. And what happens there, the reason you need to do that is there are grooves. See if I can pick this up. There are grooves here on the second pin, and as the slide stops in there, it catches in those grooves, and it's going to make it difficult to drive it out. So if you just wiggle it a little bit, that pin pops right out. We'll set that aside, set our slide stop aside, and now we need to punch out the back strap pin. And that punches out very easy. And that's all you need to do to take those out. First, we're going to take the block out, set it aside, and then I'll just take my tool and hook it underneath the ejector here and lift. And your factory trigger assembly comes right out. Now you're just going to take this whole assembly out, which is what we've got here in the new Vogel assembly, and this one obviously is fairly dirty. I've been shooting it quite a bit. We're going to set that aside. Now with the Vogel trigger, we're just going to take a pair of wire cutters here and cut the little retaining strap off. We're going to take our frame. Now, if you're a neat freak and your pistol's really dirty, when you have all these parts out, this is a really good time to get in here and clean all this stuff out. This handgun right now has about 600 to 700 rounds through it, so I'm not really going to worry about that. That's nothing as far as what this pistol is going to see this year, so I'm not going to be greatly concerned with cleaning all the crud out. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to place the housing down into the recess in the frame, and the trigger will just drop right down into its place in there, and we are going to push it down. And go ahead and set your block in there. I just want to make sure everything kind of moves in here and I can get to everything that I need. And I make sure the key thing is I want to make sure that I've got enough room for the trigger safety to disengage. So we're going to drop that back down in there. Everything looks good. Everything's moving freely. I've got our locking block in. We're going to go ahead and reinstall our pins, and we're going to take the first pin and reinstall that first. And I like to take the back corner of my armorer's tool to push the pin in and make sure that it's seated in there correctly. I don't like to use metal tools on the Glocks if I don't have to, because if you slip you can really gouge your frame pretty badly. Now we're going to take our firing pin stop, and you want to make sure that your little spring hook there on it is underneath the first pin. So when you slide it into place here, we're going to make sure that that spring goes underneath the first pin and hold it in place. Then take your second pin, which has got the grooves on it, and we're just going to push that through. And again, take our Glock tool and just push it in. And we're going to make sure that we've got spring tension. And then our backstrap pin. Now this one can be tricky if you've got a backstrap, especially the beaver tail backstrap on it. Sometimes it likes to be a little bit difficult going in, and it's a really flexible material, so you want to be careful you don't bend or break it. And again, push that back in so it's flush on either side. And now we've got our trigger installed, and it should move freely. Don't have any problems there. And that's all we need to do on the frame. So we're going to go ahead and take this and we're going to set it aside. And now we're going to work on our slide. So we're going to go ahead and strip our slide, take the recoil spring out, lift the back of the barrel, slide it out. And again, my slide's all grimy because this thing's got quite a few rounds through it so far. To disassemble the slide, I see a lot of guys will get back here and pry on the cover plate back here. Don't do that. You'll see right underneath the hook on your striker, you can see this little piece of plastic protruding here. All we're going to do is come in with our Glock tool and we're going to push that down. Once you push that down, you can slide that plate right off. Now keep your finger covering the end of it, because both your extractor spring and your striker are under spring pressure in here. And we are going to pull both of those out and set them aside. Now once that's out, you've got your firing pin block here. If you push in on the firing pin block, your extractor will fall right out. And then you can turn it over, little wrap on the bench, and out comes our firing pin block and spring. And we're going to set those aside. Now, one word of caution here, since we are working with a trigger assembly, and in order to disassemble the Glock, you do have to pull the trigger. I do recommend go ahead and using an armorer's plate, at least for the first couple of trigger pulls, to make sure that we don't have any problems. The armorer's plate, this orange one right here, is shorter than the standard cover plate, and that way we can take a tiny little flat blade screwdriver and we can get under there and we can pop the cruciform down, and we can cause the sear to discharge. That way we can get the pistol back apart should we have any issues. Now the first step is we're going to come in here and we are going to strip our striker assembly, and it is really a simple job. You're just simply going to push it down on the bench, pull down on the spring with your fingers and then pull your cups out. And as soon as you pull them up, they're going to fall apart. These cups are in really good condition because this is a relatively new pistol, so we're not worried about that. And we're going to set the original striker spring aside. Now, if this is going to be a carry gun, I highly suggest that you keep the factory striker spring in there. The factory striker spring is meant to work with the factory weight striker, and it's meant to light the widest variety of ammo possible. When we start getting down into these lightweight striker springs, this is for competition only. And when you get into lighter weight striker springs, you really need to use lighter weight primers because you may end up not lighting those primers. We're going to go ahead and use the 5-pound striker spring for right now because I want to get a little bit lighter trigger pull, but I still want to be able to light off factory ammo until we start hand loading for this gun. So now we've got our striker spring. It doesn't matter which direction it goes on, it's the same either direction. We're going to slide it down over our striker, and we're going to make sure that it's all the way down and the striker is seated appropriately in this plastic piece here. Now here's a trick for you. I can just take this and I can hold the bottom of the striker with my thumb, and I can monkey around with this and try to get the cups back on there. But there is a really easy way to do this without having to worry about the plastic piece sliding around. The back of your slide has a hole that this fits just perfectly into. So you can set it in just like that. You can draw the spring back and hold it down and put your first cup on. Make sure that that's held in there. Grab your second spring cup, and we're just going to slide them in there together, and there you go. It's simple, it's easy. We're not monkeying around trying to hold that on there. It's really not difficult at all. So now your striker assembly is back together. Now we are going to take our firing pin block and we're going to drop it into the slide, and that's our new highly polished firing pin block. Take our extractor, drop it back in, and the extractor holds the firing pin block in place. So that's the relationship there. We're going to take our extractor spring, and the metal part goes forward. Don't get them reversed. They don't work well reversed. And slide that forward. Slide our striker back in here. And then we're going to take our armorer's plate and we're going to slide this on. Now when you're putting these back on, go ahead and get your plate in position, and I'll reach in here with my finger and I will push the striker down first, and so that slid over and it's holding the striker in, and then I'll take my tool and I'll push down on the extractor spring and then push the plate the rest of the way in place. And I like to cover it with my hand, because if you don't get that plate down on there quickly, then that can go sailing. So now we've got our plate on. We're just going to go ahead and drop our barrel back in, drop our recoil spring assembly in. The thick part goes forward because this is a Gen 4 pistol. It does have the dual spring assembly here. And then push it forward a little bit and hook it down underneath the half moon recess underneath the barrel. Make sure you get that pushed down before you try to assemble the gun. We're going to go ahead and line everything up. Get our slide back on there. First thing, we're just going to see if the trigger will drop, and it does. We got a nice quick reset, smooth take up. Now I'll comment on this right away, and of course we haven't put any lubrication or anything in here. It definitely feels lighter, and the first thing that I note is the take up is really smooth. There is still a wall. It's not as an abrupt wall as the factory trigger. So if you're not careful, you'll pull right through it, which is actually kind of a good thing when you're speed shooting. You don't want to take up, stop, and then go. So we can get through that fairly quickly without really a disruption of the sight picture, I think. And once you press, really don't have all that much over travel on this. I don't think I'm going to mess with the over travel stop right now. I'm going to leave it in the factory position. If you wanted to adjust it, of course, we'll have to punch that pin out, lift things up, and go in there and turn that screw in a little bit to affect the over travel. I've gone through a couple of aftermarket Glock trigger setups before on other guns where you lost the reset. The reset became really mushy. And I greatly dislike that, because if you're trying to quickly and accurately fire shots, I like that reset. I like to know, okay, there it is. Really, for me, it helps with follow through. But this is really nice. I really like the way it feels. Let's go ahead and put the trigger gauge on it here. All right, we're zeroed out, and our first pull, 3 pounds, 9.5 ounces. Trying to make sure I get this back in the appropriate position. Trigger gauge isn't working with us here. Okay, and again, we have to make sure we press down the trigger safety when we're doing this. 3 pounds, 6 ounces. 3 pounds, 5.3 ounces. 3 pounds, 8 ounces. Okay, so we've now got a sub 4 pound trigger on this Gen 4 Glock 17, and it is very smooth. There's no grit. There's a nice, there is a wall, so it does still, in effect, feel like a two-stage trigger for those of you two-stage trigger rifle shooters. So you have the take up, hit the wall, and then the break. Quick, distinct reset. Easy break. Now, anytime you install a trigger system, you do want to make sure that your safeties are still functioning. We first want to make sure that our trigger safety is functioning. We'll go ahead and reinstall the slide to do this. I want to make sure that the trigger safety is functioning, so I grab the trigger on either sides and pull back. We'll go ahead and fire it, cycle it, and the trigger is going far enough forward that our trigger safety is functioning. Some aftermarket triggers that mess with the position of the trigger can leave the trigger too far back that the safety doesn't actually reset on the trigger. You need to make sure that's coming far enough forward that you get that reset. We really haven't changed our forward position of our trigger with this system, so that is not a big concern. But if you go messing around with that, it is. We want to make sure that our drop safety is functioning when the trigger is in its forward position. Then our cruciform is up on the forward portion of the drop safety. We want to make sure that the cruciform can actually drop down until the trigger is pressed to the rear. That's how the drop safety functions. And everything in this trigger is functioning just the way it previously did. Now, if you really want to set this over travel stop on the razor's edge, then all you would do was you would dial the over travel stop forward enough that it just stops the sear or the trigger bar after we pass the drop safety portion of it. And it honestly looks like right out of the factory box it's already there, that the over travel screw is stopping it just after we get past the drop safety portion and that trigger bar and the cruciform sear drops down. So that's it for making sure that everything appears to function correctly. Now, this is approximately a 4 pound trigger. Some people will get all up in arms and say that you should not modify your trigger system on a carry gun. If we are judging this just on weight alone, and now since I have modified the trigger, I absolutely positively must test fire this gun before it's good to go for carry. Before I would ever think about using it for defensive purposes, I have to go to the range and test fire this gun with both my training ammo and with my carry ammo, and put at least a box of carry ammo. It's expensive, but your life's worth it. Put a box of carry ammo through it to make sure that it is going to fire just fine. I'm not going to have any light strikes. I'm not going to have any problem lighting off any of that ammo. Now, on the trigger pull weight, 4 pounds, in my opinion, is not too light for a carry gun. My factory 1911 from Colt has a trigger pull that is right in that range, and that is a single action trigger. Again, this is a Glock. The Glock has a built-in trigger safety, so it's very difficult to accidentally pull that trigger unless you actually get your finger in there and depress that trigger safety. If you're carrying in an appropriate holster and you are utilizing proper techniques when you holster up your weapon, which means holster nice and slowly, make sure that there's nothing through the trigger guard when you press it into your holster, then there's really not going to be a problem. As far as the actual pull weight and negligent discharges, your trigger finger should not be on the trigger unless your sights are aligned and you made the conscious decision to fire a shot. There's really no excuse for anything other than that. If your trigger finger is not on the trigger, it doesn't matter that if this is a 2-pound trigger or an 8-pound trigger. The weapon's not going to fire. If you're tickling the trigger when you shouldn't, there's no excuse for it anyway. You're just a negligent discharge waiting to happen. So on the weight point alone, I don't think that a 4-pound trigger is going to be too heavy to carry. If I would decide to carry this gun with that trigger in there, then I would probably go back in and I'd drop some Loctite or something on the over travel screw just to make sure that it doesn't move during recoil. Again, I recommend the factory factory striker spring. That way it gives you the best chance of lighting off your widest variety of ammunition. We may monkey around and try the different springs. We will get back to you when we do the full review of this trigger and let you know how that worked, because it's very easy to swap these out at the range to see which spring is best suited to our purposes here. A lighter striker spring, since when you pull the trigger you're actually cocking the striker, a lighter striker spring will result in a lighter trigger pull, but because we're working with angles and geometry here, how much lighter I do not know until we actually get out and start working with it. Overall, this trigger feels very nice. Yes, it's costly. They run about $150, but when you compare that to what you spend for a match rifle trigger, it's pretty much in line. I like the fact that it appears to be original parts. It is legal for stock service pistol division in IDPA, so I also like that because this pistol is what I shoot in stock service pistol division. Now, a really nice thing about this trigger system is, let's say you get this in, you shoot it for a while, for whatever reason, either you decide to sell the gun and you want to put it back to factory condition, maybe you are hesitant to sell a modified handgun to someone, then you can put the factory components back in it. If you decide you don't want to carry with a modified trigger, you can put the factory components back inside of it. If you're going to a class or something where you want that heavy trigger pull back in there for whatever reason, then it takes all of 5 minutes to put that trigger back inside your handgun. It takes me far less time to actually swap these components out than it does for me to explain how to go about doing it. And really the only tool you need is your Glock Armor's tool here, or a suitably sized punch, or even an Allen key will actually work. All that's left for us now is to take it out to the range. We're going to do some live fire with it, do some training with it, get it on the timer, and I will see how much difference this trigger makes to the previous trigger. I can tell you already I like it. I have a feeling it's going to make longer shots easier on me, and I think it's going to reduce my split times just a little bit, but we will wait and see. So that's it for installing the trigger. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below or send it to us on Facebook or Twitter. If you like the video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, no matter if you're doing it with a Glock or any other pistol or rifle, get out and shoot.